Good morning, everyone. Today I'll be talking about anger, and to begin with, I'll recount the first time that I truly realised the power that anger can have over a person. And that time was when I was back in high school. And as a high schooler, I was quite a good student, fairly quiet, kept to myself a bit. Bit of a gentle giant, you might say. But at the same time, I was also a decent athlete, and I played Aussie rules football ever since I was a little kid. And if you know AFL football, it's a full contact sport, not for the faint of heart. You learn how to hit, take hits, tackle, be tackled. And as a teenager, my high school team was actually won two high school state championships back to back. So it was a very high caliber team. And we were playing against very capable opposition. And in that team, I just knew my role and I stuck to it. But there was one match that stood out above them all in that time, and that match was at Burberry Agricultural High School. And their oval, that they used to grow sheep there, so when you played on that oval, they had sheep droppings when you played all over the field. And during that game, I remember I was at the bottom of the pack, and my hand was out. Someone walked by and scripted me. They deliberately tread on your hand with their boot with the spikes on it, the studs. And after that, because I was on the bottom, someone pushed my head into the turf, which was covered in droppings. And at that moment, I was absolutely furious. And I get up and try to figure out who did that, who did that. And of course, nobody put their hand up and said, yes, that was me. So I was livid. And I remember, I took my frustration, my anger out on that game. I demanded the ball. I was breaking tackles. I remember throwing people over the boundary line. Crashing packs. That game I just absolutely dominated. And I remember at the end of the year during the presentation, where they give out the best, the votes for best players. And for that particular game, I remember the words that were said. They said, "Oh, we all remember that game. We don't know what got into Wayne, but we do know the beast was unleashed." So, so my first experience with anger and its power was actually a good one. Okay, to me and everyone else, it was apparent, and it feels right because it's a natural reaction. But when you feel something unjust has happened to you, your body calls in additional reinforcements because you think you've been wronged. So you need to do something about that. And so when you're angry, you feel stronger, you feel braver, you're very impulsive, you're determined, you're persistent. You feel large and in control because nobody's going to come and mess with you. But even though it's a very powerful force, it's actually a very destructive force. It's very volatile, hostile, and explosive. And that's why I've got a picture of the Hulk up there. You know what happens when the Hulk gets mad. The point here is, there's a little Hulk in all of us. I wouldn't know it because you're all so friendly and welcoming here on Sunday, but I'm sure we all get angry, and I'm sure we've all done something to make other people angry. Even little kids, toddlers, are known for their temper tantrums. And the Bible clearly warns us to try and not be angry. So those verses there in Ephesians and Colossians are basically telling us to put away all your anger, wrath, and disrespectful talk, because it only leads to evil. Even more than that, not only should we avoid becoming angry, but we should try to avoid anger altogether. So Proverbs as a book of wisdom, I've got two verses there about anger, and it says to avoid those who are prone to anger, because they only stir up strife and they transgress often. And what it means to transgress is it's a conscious defiance of a known standard or law. So a transgression is like a deliberate act in defiance of something. So here that the Bible's referring to knowingly going against God's standards when you're angry. Despite this, but we also know that anger in and of itself, by its nature, it is not a sin. And we know that because just as being tempted is not a sin, and having money is not a sin, because these things are morally neutral. You can use them to pursue good, or use them for evil ends as well. Which is why in Ephesians 4:26 we say, "Be angry and do not sin." You can't say, "Worship other gods and do not sin. Be lustful and do not sin." But you can be angry and not sin. So essentially, it's our attitude towards anger which makes all the difference. And how do we know this biblically? But through the examples of righteous anger. So if anger was sinful, then both God and Jesus Christ were sinful too. And just a couple of verses which attest to that. In Psalms 86:15, it refers to God being slow to anger. Not that God can't be angry, or that because if God could be angry, God can only do good and be good. And I spoke a few weeks ago about Zephaniah. God is slow to anger, but at some point he will repay in justice. But we also think about the wrath of God, okay, which is revealed, and we know the wrath of God mainly through the Old Testament when we think of how many times the Israelites were punished and incurred God's wrath. We think of the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, the Egyptians, and the Israelites, right? But all of these people endured God's wrath. But perhaps more relatable are the instances where Jesus demonstrated anger. Jesus as a human, capable of all that we feel and can know. So the last two dot points there, we have three occasions. One, the first of which is Mark 10:13 through 16, which is when Jesus welcomes or brings the little children to him. Because the disciples tried to prevent the children from coming to Jesus. And Jesus was indignant, which is a form of anger. He said, "Let the little children come to me." A second example is in Mark 3:1 through 6, which is when Jesus heals on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees are there, and they're questioning the law about working on the Sabbath. And he looks at them in anger. Okay, so not necessarily words or actions, but just a look, a thought that can still be angry. And perhaps the most well-known example, and I've quoted John 2:13 through 17, is when Jesus clears out the temple courts. So he made a whip out of cords, he flipped tables, he knocked all their coins over, the money changers, the animal sellers, he drove out of the temple courtyard. And his disciples remembered that he did it with great zeal. Okay, and when you refer back to what they were quoting, which is Psalm 69, that zeal refers to anger, not like an enthusiasm, oh, you're really looking forward to flipping these tables. All right, so when we think about anger versus righteous anger, our anger is very seldom righteous. It can be, but most likely it's not. And when we think of wrath, when we get very angry, wrath is like extreme anger with an intent to punish or take revenge. Our wrath is considered one of the 7 deadly sins. Yet God's wrath is part of his very nature. And we know God can only do good and be good. And a good example of that is in Jonah, the end of Jonah, chapter 4. And if you remember Jonah, even after God spares the city of Nineveh, Jonah's angry. So angry that he wishes he were dead. And God asks him Jonah, is it right for you to be angry? First time, there's no response. The second time, God provides a tree, a plant, to provide shade because it's very hot and windy. And then God takes away the tree and he grows faint and he's angry again. And so God asks him again, is it right for you to be angry? And what God was basically saying was, he was taking Jonah's anger about a tree, something which he had done nothing to cultivate, something which disappeared overnight. He said, you're angry about that, and you compare that to my compassion over a city of, a whole lost nation of spiritually lost people. So when we think about our anger, but we're more like Jonah than God. Whole point there with Isaiah 55, 8 through 9, even though we experience the suffering and the anger, it's important to know that God's thoughts and his ways are above our thoughts and our ways. So, but it's something we've got to be conscious of. And a good starting point is to understand the source of anger. But where does anger come from? And what makes you angry might not make me angry. We're all built different. But the one thing that's in common is that anger always stems from some source of pain or hurt. And sometimes that may come from physical pain, like on the football field. If someone comes up and slaps you in the face, you're going to be quite mad. But more often than not, it's from emotional or mental pain. Someone insults you, someone defames you or ruins your reputation, and that these are the things that are much more likely to happen. So two common sources of anger, disappointment and frustration. So if you think about what disappointment is, we have hopes and expectations that we set and we hope to come true. And when we realize those hopes and expectations don't come true, that results in disappointment. And following that disappointment comes anger. And a classic example of this is anyone who's had kids. They come home and they make plans or they have expectations. Oh, me and Billy made arrangements to have a sleepover. So can we do that? Blah, blah, blah. No, you can't. What happens when that child's expectations are dashed? They become angry. And disappointment is a form of pain which leads to anger. Think about frustration, which is really repeated disappointment. Okay, in terms of trying to achieve like a longer term goal. Okay, you aim for your promotion, you try 5, 6, 7 times, you never get it. That leads to frustration, which leads to anger. And going back to football, if you see fights on a professional sports match, they never happen at the start of the match. They always happen at the end of the match. Because one team's lost hope, they know they can't win, they're very frustrated, and they take that frustration out. So once you know the source, you think about the consequences of being angry. And the important thing here is that often we don't direct our anger at the source of the anger. We take it out on innocent bystanders. And for most of us, that's going to be those nearest and dearest to us at home. So for example, when we can't become angry with certain people in certain situations, that's when the innocent people suffer. If you think about like a traffic jam, just stuck in a traffic jam for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, what starts to happen? People start beeping their horns, some people get out of the car, road rage, people get angry with each other, but even though it's not anyone's fault. I remember driving in the USA for the first time, and what we had to do was, we were in Los Angeles, an 8-lane highway. You had to get from the left side to the right side in the space of about a few hundred meters. And I remember the guy at the airport said, he goes, "Oh, this is your first time?" And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "Just remember, when people get angry here, we had guns. So yeah, but that filled me with great optimism. But perhaps a more relatable example is when you've just had a bad day, you suffered at work, your boss chews you out, you think you've been treated unfairly, and you miss the last bus, and you lose your umbrella, get rained on, you're almost home, you trip in the gutter, you graze your knee. So you open the door, get home, and what do? You don't say, honey, I've had a bad day. You slam the door, you start yelling, and who suffers from your anger? It's not the boss, it's not the work, it's not anyone else, it's your wife, kids, family. So we think about our anger being misdirected. Now, the danger in expressing anger this way is not only that innocent people suffer, but what tends to happen is when someone's angry, anger provokes more anger. Okay, so you imagine if you're just minding your own business and someone gets in your face and starts yelling at you, pointing fingers, okay, you're naturally going to feel angry or mad yourself. Okay, so escalating anger, anger building upon anger is how wars start. Okay, it's why families have been feuding for generations. Okay, you think of Jacob and Esau, when we tend to make mountains out of molehills, little problems turn into big problems. Small anger turns into big anger. And you think of like some of those TV shows where they show the neighbours who keep fighting with each other. Nobody's willing to quit. Then they take more and more severe measures. And sometimes people forget what they're angry about in the first place. Okay. So yeah, but when we pursue payback, okay, that's when anger builds upon anger. And that's where we get sayings like, you know, an eye for an eye makes the world go blind. Okay, because anger provokes more anger and retaliatory action. So here, we think of the consequences not only on other people, but on ourselves as well. So when we're angry, we often end up hurting ourselves because when we lose our temper, okay, that to lose your temper means you've lost your uh, you lose your temperance, which is meaning you lose your modesty, you lose your ability to be self-controlled. And that's your thoughts and your actions. And so when you're angry, anger consumes you completely. So you lose control of your mind and your body, even if it's temporary. Okay, a moment of madness can have far-reaching consequences. But once you turn into the Hulk, you can't reason with the Hulk. You can't soothe him down. He's angry, he's destructive. So that's the part of the consequence himself. And even worse, when we hold on to that anger, what it means is people become bitter, resentful, they hold grudges, okay? And that anger builds and builds and builds. And that's the pathway to sin because you carry that burden with you for the rest of your life and you take it out on the world. You know, it's the sort of people where you have to be very careful what you say around them. And ticking time bombs, you have to walk on eggshells. You know, I'm probably guilty of this, but you know, when you have an argument with your partner and they bring up something from 20 years ago, and it's because the anger hasn't been resolved, it's still sitting there. And just a bit of a dramatic question here, because this is how it was when I was reading about it. How do you invite the devil into your bedroom at night? And the answer here is by carrying your anger over to the next day. So when that famous verse, in your anger do not sin, do not let the sun go down while you're still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. So if you go to sleep and hold on to your anger till the next day, you're letting the devil into your life. Because but when you hold on to that anger, the devil plants thoughts of revenge, hostility, bitterness, how the world is unfair. Okay. And unresolved anger breeds the exact opposite attitude to that of the second greatest commandment, which is love your neighbor as yourself. When you're angry generally not at a thing, I'll never be angry at a table or a microphone. You're angry with people. People disappoint people. Okay. So the lesson here is to put away your angry thoughts, words, and deeds very quickly each night. And just like the hymn we sang earlier, angry words, don't let them slip out of your mouth. Okay, because what you think impacts what you say impacts what you do. Yeah. So always check them before they spoil the lid. Another consequence of anger on ourselves is when you think about what anger brings, all those attributes, think about what the fruits of the Spirit are. Fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. You can't be angry and demonstrate the fruits of the Spirit. And so you can't be angry and joyful, but that's probably some sort of psychiatric disorder, right? You can't be angry and peaceful. You can't be angry and in self-control. Yeah, so we need to be careful also of not just repressing all of our anger to the point where it builds up and up and up and then it just explodes. And if you've ever watched The Simpsons, Ned Flanders is a good example of that. There's one episode where he just has too much of Homer and he just explodes in a rage of anger. So yeah, dangerous itself. So the first tip on how to deal with anger is you look past the anger to the source of the pain. Okay, because it's always much easier to deal with the source of the pain than to confront the anger head on. So if you can feel disappointment, frustration, or pain, it's important not to react rashly. You've got to give yourself time to persevere, exercise self-control, put your pain through the fruits of the Spirit. So when we're angry, we should be aware of where that anger is coming from. And when someone is angry with us, okay, you don't get defensive. You try not to respond with anger and kind. You remind them, oh, we're here to try to help. I'm not here to try to harm you. Which is why we have sayings in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, books of wisdom again, about how gentle words and calmness turns away wrath and anger. Why? Because it's addressing the pain. You're trying to soothe the pain, not confronting the anger. And so when we are in step with the fruits of the Spirit, we should aspire to the following. So just like we said about God, we should be slow to anger, be quick to identify it and put it away. And that's what those 3 verses there attest to: Ecclesiastes and 2 from Proverbs. Books of wisdom again: slow to anger, be quick to put it away. And the verse there on the picture on the right from James, yeah, it's, we think about, not only being slow to anger, but how many chances did God give to the Israelites before he showed his wrath? Think of the Egyptians. How many chances and plagues did he send on the Egyptians before he took real action? And think about how many chances God gives us, despite our sinful nature. And so the key point of this side is anger is not equal to righteousness, but it is equal to foolishness and strife. So, yeah, I'm a big fan of the WWJD. What would Jesus do? So like I said, there's 3 times when Christ displayed his righteous anger. So in the temple courtyard, when the little children couldn't seek him, and when the Pharisees criticized him for healing on the Sabbath. And if you think about what each of those instances has in common, Jesus was pained. Jesus had pain in his heart because of the hardness of heart of these other people. A lack of compassion, which prevented people from seeking out God. from not being able to go to the temple courtyard, the Gentiles, to go and seek God. That's when Jesus showed his anger. How is that different from us? So there's four key things here. There is sort of like an incorrect way to think of God's anger, and that is Jesus got angry, so it's okay for me to be angry too. That's not what the Bible is trying to tell us, because it's clear there that we shouldn't be angry. What the Bible is trying to tell us is the difference between righteous anger and the anger we normally experience. So the first difference is when we think of Jesus and his anger, he remained in control of his faculties. Okay, and that's what makes it righteous. We lose control of our thoughts, our speech, and actions when we're angry. We say things we don't mean, we do things we don't want to do. That was not Jesus. Secondly, and I think most importantly out of these 4 points, Jesus was never angry at any of the pain or suffering directed towards him. Think of all the pain and suffering Jesus went through. Never got angry. But when you stop people seeking out God, he flips tables and becomes indignant. It's not his personal suffering, it's the suffering of others. Whereas for us, it's normally the pain we feel, it's all about us. And third, Jesus directed his anger against those responsible for the pain and suffering of others. The Pharisees, the money changers in the temple, the disciples who prevented the children from coming to him. Okay, but whereas for us, as I mentioned before, we tend to misdirect our anger at whoever's nearest. And fourthly, Jesus brought about real change, because his divine justice is served. He's the lawgiver, and he can promote justice through his actions, whereas our anger is mostly ineffective, and it tends to lead to remorse and regret. Just a quick example here of a story. Last words matter, and that I remember a story about one young woman, and she had an argument with her father. It was about money or a boy. And anyway, she ended up being very angry, and she said to her dad, "I hope you die." The very next day, the father was in a car accident and died. And that young lady was telling her story about, "I have to live with those rash words for the rest of my life." Okay, so you think about that moment of madness, okay, and what it can lead to. So the second tip of how to deal with anger is to remember that we don't deserve anything better than what God has already given us. So whether the pain we suffer is right or wrong, it is not the point. The point is God brought it into our life. So we need to reflect on how little we actually deserve from God and reflect on how much he's given us. So when we think of the price of our salvation, when Jesus hung upon that cross, the love and forgiveness of Jesus extends to all of us, despite his pain and suffering. And so when you reflect on what Christ gave us in his loving and forgiving ways, how can we not extend that same love and forgiveness to others? Tip 3. So no matter how much pain and suffering is in the world, no matter how much we endure, remember that God is working for us. And our troubles are only temporary in nature, which is preparing us for eternal glory. As the slide there, 2 Corinthians 4:17 says. So God works all things for our good, even the bad things that we think, that they're there for our good, for our growth, our development. So we persevere in the face of pain, looking for the silver lining of God's goodness. So if we think of Job, the message there is God is in control of all things. When you shake your fist at God and show God your anger, we forget our place, which is the whole message in Job. And fourth tip, so we become angry when those who have wronged us aren't punished by society. He got away with it. Well, they got away with it. There's no jail time, there's no fine, police don't get involved, nothing is happening. And so people tend not to believe, they don't see any justice. Because we want justice served on our terms and in our time frame. I want my will to be done, not thy will to be done. So no matter how much we try to take matters into our own hands, but we have to remember that we can't settle all our accounts, but we need God to do that. And as that verse in James attests, there's only one lawgiver, it's one judge, the one who's able to save and destroy. But you and me, who are we to judge and take the place of God? So without God, there can be no overall justice served. And the final tip here is building on that same passage, but nobody gets away with anything. Not you, not me, not anyone in history. Why? Because God is a God of perfect justice. No wrongdoing will ever go unpunished. So the punishment for the sin of all believers has already been paid on the cross. And the sins of those who remain opposed to Christ, they will also be face punishment and God's justice one day. So in Romans 12:19 it says, "Don't take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord." Okay, so in one, Revelation is coming. Jesus will come again. And the whole point there is he's coming in judgment, and what he did with the money changers in the temple courtyard, he'll do again. But in respect of anger, I'll close with this. The rest of that passage where God says, "Leave the sins and wrongdoing to me. I will punish the wrongdoing and I will serve justice. As for you, you do what is right and try to be at peace. If your enemies or those who seek to harm you or cause you pain, if they're hungry, give them food. If they're thirsty, give them a drink." The whole point is God does the punishing and the judging. We try to overcome evil with good. And as the slide here says on the right, we always try to do the right thing, even when you've been done wrong. Thank you.